Hello, and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Durval Bazi, and this is the Demystify series. Join us as we unravel pressing climate and sustainability challenges and innovative solutions. Today, we're demystifying the controversial topic of carbon capture. On today's show, I am joined by Ms. Marsha King to break down the facts on the technology, its applications, challenges, and solutions. Marsha King is a sustainable energy PhD student in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. She received her bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering technology from South Carolina State University and holds a master's degree in renewable energy and sustainability systems with a concentration in wind energy from Pennsylvania State University. Marsha is also a research associate in the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at ASU, working under Dr. Klaus Lackner, where she studies direct air capture of carbon dioxide and justice. Before starting at ASU, she spent over a decade working in the oil and gas industry in Houston, Texas, the United Kingdom, countries throughout Latin America, and her home country of Trinidad and Tobago. Marsha, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Marsha, can you start us off by explaining what is carbon capture and how it works?
Sure. So, carbon capture is essentially a method of moving carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere after it's been emitted or while it's being emitted. When we talk about planting trees to offset our carbon emissions, essentially that's what we're trying to do with natural features such as trees. We're trying to do things that will remove the carbon that we put into the atmosphere. This is more of an engineering approach to it, where you use machines. They have different designs that are in different stages of development to do the same thing, which is remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and keep it separate so that we can reduce the effects of climate change that we're experiencing right now. And so there are generally two ways to do this. One is point source capture, which you'll hear referred to as CCS or CCUS, which stands for carbon capture and storage or carbon capture use and storage. And this is where it's captured at a point source. So the point at where it's emitted. So you go to a refinery or a fossil fuel powered electricity generation plant. And so the CCS equipment is either built along with the plant or it can be added on afterward to capture the carbon dioxide that's being released. And so that's the established form that's been around for a while. The newer form that we're trying to develop, and this is what my lab and at Arizona State does, the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions, is the method called direct air capture or DAC for short. And with DAC, you try to remove carbon dioxide from the ambient air. So instead of going to where it's emitted, where it's more concentrated, you set up a DAC plant in a place. You can set it up anywhere because the thing about carbon dioxide is that once it's emitted, it spreads out pretty evenly over the surface of the earth. So anywhere you go on the surface, you have the same concentration, which is just about 420 parts per million. And so the general goal is to remove enough so we can get it back down to safe levels where we're no longer experiencing the impacts of climate change. And the international sort of goal or agreement on where that is about 350 parts per million. And so for reference, in 1960, it was just under 320 parts per million. So in the years since 1960, which is not such a long time ago, we've gone from under 320 parts per million to, and not to get too technical, 420, a little bit over 420 parts per million. So that's just in a short amount of time, we've raised the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere by that much, and that's what's causing the changes that we see in temperatures. So the capture itself is done by exposing the air that the gases are contained in, so CO2 specifically, to a sorbent that essentially binds the CO2 molecules to itself, and then you can remove them afterward using either heat or moisture, or in some cases, both. And so you regenerate your solvent so you can reuse it, and then you separate the carbon dioxide into a purer stream that you can then transport and sequester. The solvents are typically what we call amines, and that's I don't think we need to go into what amines are necessarily, but they can either be liquid or solid, and it depends on the design of the capture technology that you're using, whether they use liquid or solid, and they still are designing amines and or other solvents as well, not just amines, in forms that will make the process more efficient. Because this, as I mentioned before, is a very, very small concentration. It's too much for what we want to maintain, but it's still very small. And so um, having that be as efficient as possible lowers the cost of it and increases our capacity to remove more quickly. So the other side of that is that capturing doesn't really do too much if you can't do something with it after you've captured it. So you have to put it away somewhere that isolates it from the atmosphere permanently. And the most popular way to do that right now is by injecting it underground into porous formations. And depending on what the formation is, it will either stay there in the tiny pore spaces in between the rocks, or depending on what the composition of the rocks are, it can react with them and form certain types of carbonates. And that's a more permanent way because it can't move once it's in solid form. And that's the most secure sequestration method. So in between the capturing and the sequestering, it's usually transported by pipelines, and this is for very large volumes. If you don't have a large enough volume, usually it's not worth the investment in installing pipelines, so they can transport it by truck, depending on most of this is depending on the finances and the economic outlook of the project that we're looking at. So that is in a nutshell. I hope I didn't get too technical there. What carbon capture in the two forms that we generally are trying to implement it at are.
You kind of got into it, but I do want to get a bit more into the benefits that this technology offers. We know that carbon dioxide is a primary greenhouse gas that is responsible for global warming and fueling climate change, and therefore, much of our efforts in the fight against climate change is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing carbon emissions. This technology offers that opportunity to support the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So, can you share with us some more insight on the benefit of this technology in a practical sense?
Sure. So, one of the reasons for focusing on carbon dioxide specifically, uh, even though it's not the most potent greenhouse gas that we have, is that it is the most abundant. I talked about it being 420 ppm, parts per million, sorry, before. All the other ones are much less concentrated. So if you're going to try to capture something, you want to get, I guess, suppose the best value for money, you're going to want to capture the one that's easiest, because everything else would just be you'd capture very little for your efforts. And so that's the reason behind, targeting carbon dioxide as the major greenhouse gas that we try to capture. So the benefit of being able to do that is, just the thing that you guessed, it helps to provide a way to fix some of the failures that we've experienced globally to decarbonize. And we've been working on this decarbonization problem for some time, and you'll see recent IPCC reports coming out that we're not doing a very good job of it globally in decarbonizing. You're starting to see some progress in a reduction in coal use in some of the developed countries. But to a large extent, US and Europe are really quite dependent on gas still for energy generation. Even as they are building out renewable energy, they're still highly dependent on natural gas to power it. So we're not to the point where we are actually doing a really good job of reducing those carbon emissions as yet. There are industries that are much harder to decarbonize. So if you're talking about generating electricity for everyday use, we kind of know how to do that with wind and solar, even though they're still expanding gas plant usage. But there are a lot harder ones to decarbonize, such as industrial processes that require very high temperatures to operate at. And there isn't a really good way to use renewable energy to provide that kind of power. And so those are a lot harder to do. Transportation is another one. You'll hear people talk about investing in renewable jet fuels and renewable transportation fuels. We've had a lot of switching to compressed natural gas as a fuel for transportation, but these still come with emissions. We also have a lot of countries that are just developing their natural gas or oil or coal resources. And some of them are doing it for export, and some of them are doing it to electrify their own countries, which are still, largely have low electrification to some of their poorer citizens. And so it's not necessarily feasible for them to be asked, but in a polite way, to stop doing that because the rest of us are feel that we're in danger to do that. So it can help deal with emissions from countries that can't afford right now to decarbonize, even as they are electrifying. And it can help deal with legacy emissions, things that CO2 that we've already emitted over the years, over the decades, or that come from transportation from tailpipes. You can't really do point source on every single car or truck or ship that is transporting things that we want to get across the world every day or across the country. So there are a lot of things that we are not doing or find that we can't do right now. And this is essentially a way to help us deal with that as we figure out how we're going to decarbonize these other systems that we depend on so heavily. That's one of the advantages. That's the largest advantage, essentially. Another advantage is that, as I mentioned before, you can put it anywhere. It doesn't need to go next to a plant. It can be done globally, even if it's not in the country where it's emitted. And so this sort of enables countries that may not have had a energy resource that they could have developed in the past to enter what is more of a climate economy, but is closely related to the energy economy. For example, I know that Kenya has been looking at developing their carbon capture and sequestration economy because they have mineralization resources that they can use to get rid of some of this carbon for us. And companies are and countries are willing to pay for that. There isn't necessarily a developed market for it yet. And so most of the activity behind it are essentially incentivized by governments. But a lot of people see it as a way forward with the energy transition, and you're going to see it being more and more relied upon in IPCC reports when they look at what the status of our fight against climate change is. You see increasingly they add more carbon removal as a method of dealing with the decarbonization problem.
As you mentioned, carbon capture is being featured more and more in decarbonization strategies, in addition to transitioning to renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency, and the electrification of systems. There is an acceptance that those strategies that I just mentioned can only do so much given the pace at which the transition is happening. And there's a need to deal with the emissions that continue from sectors that are hard to transition, hard to electrify, and in sectors and in countries where their systems remain dependent on fossil fuels. So carbon capture is definitely being promoted as a climate solution. However, there are groups that argue against its deployment, and in their view, the risks seem to outweigh the benefits that you have outlined. Some see it as a greenwashing tool or a strategy to really avoid or delay the rapid phase out of fossil fuels. In your view, why is carbon capture considered a controversial climate solution?
So there are a lot of groups that do consider it a false solution, if you will. Um, Reasons vary by group. Generally speaking, people are assuming, and rightly so in a lot of instances, that this is going to be a reason that people use not to decarbonize. And so you have a lot of environmental groups that are against it because they say that, it doesn't actually fix the problem, that it is a tool for fossil fuel companies to continue their existence when they should be, being phased out. And they're not wrong because we have seen companies, there's one company in particular that has really focused in on carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal as their future business plan. That's Occidental Petroleum. And they've, for a while now, been making big investments in the future of carbon removal. You also see that with coal companies, particularly in the US, that are saying that, now that we have this, we have a safe and reliable and clean form of energy, when that is not necessarily true at all. And then one of the reasons that people say that this is really just a money making tool for oil and gas is that a lot of the projects that are being built by oil and gas companies or being sponsored. A lot of the research that is being done is being sponsored by these companies. And they are likely to be big winners in the end because many of the skills, resources, tools, technologies that we're going to be using to sequester this carbon dioxide came out of oil and gas companies. So currently, most of the carbon dioxide that's captured by CCS in the US is used for enhanced oil recovery. And essentially, that is the same process of injecting the carbon dioxide into a depleted reservoir where they can't retrieve the remaining oil and gas that are in there very easily. And so it pressurizes the formation and pushes the oil toward the production well, where it would not have moved by itself before. And so when you have that kind of experience, when you have the software that shows you how to do this coming out of this particular industry, it's not unreasonable to assume that they are going to be winners in this. And considering that beginning oil and gas is where most of this problem started in the first place, they feel it's unfair that they should also be able to make money off of solving the problem. Another reason that is expensive, and it is particularly in the case of direct air capture, it is not necessarily well developed at the commercial scale yet. So, as I mentioned before, most of the activity that's going on now is being incentivized by governments and in some cases by large corporations that are looking to reduce their carbon footprint. So you have about 130 projects worldwide that are at different stages, and not all of them are going to be built in the end because some of them are simply just being developed. Some of them have started and are committed. But there isn't necessarily a market for carbon removal other than the volunteer carbon market, which is what the corporations participate in. So without that market, then there is if nobody's paying you to remove this carbon dioxide, then there is no business plan to build these plants. And so that's where the government incentives come in to make it more profitable for private enterprise to do this. Given that it takes quite a bit of energy, so if you have a point source capture CCS on a power plant, for example, some of the power from the plant is actually going to be used for the CCS. And so it reduces the efficiency of the plant to begin with, and it also doesn't capture all of the carbon dioxide that's being emitted. What it also doesn't capture is a lot of the other toxic emissions that are as a result of burning fossil fuels or processing fossil fuels. What a lot of people who work on carbon capture will tell you is that this is in fact not a replacement for decarbonization. This has to be done in addition to decarbonization because we simply will never reach the scale that we need to capture all the carbon if we continue to emit indiscriminately. Of course, this hasn't really stopped, companies, fossil fuel companies, from touting it as a solution to the problem, but it is controversial in those ways in that we may need it, but the potential for it to be used to continue the cycle of emissions that we've been seeing is massive. It's already happening. And in addition to it being expensive, it continues its emissions. Now, a lot of projects are looking to power, particularly direct air capture, with renewable energy so that it does not have in of itself a carbon footprint. Well, one of the issues with that is that there's the view that this renewable energy could replace fossil fuels on the grid instead of being used to power this unnecessary technology that they're trying to introduce. And so those are some of the controversial issues that are being had, that we're seeing emerge as these technologies are being developed and becoming more popular, and we're relying on them more extensively to deal with carbon emissions.
So, on the one hand, carbon capture can potentially transform energy systems. However, on the other side, it can be a tool to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry and
Mhm.
ultimately worsen climate change.
Yes, that's what the fear is.
So the question is, should we be focusing on carbon capture or investing our attention and resources on other strategies for decarbonization?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we necessarily have to choose one or should choose one. I think we are at the point where we should be trying to do both of them. I know that there are people, particularly environmental groups and environmental justice groups, that think that we should be only pursuing natural methods of removing carbon dioxide, for example, forestation, and other natural methods that people think are less invasive. But if you look at the history of our attempts to decarbonize globally, we haven't been doing a particularly good job. And the directions now with the electrification of developing countries, the very low income countries, and even in developed countries like the US and Europe, where they are building out natural gas and LNG infrastructure, because right now the US is the largest producer of natural gas in the world. I don't think we're going in a direction where we can say that this is going to go as quickly as we hoped or wished it would. And a lot of these new natural gas, some of these new natural gas plants are being driven by things that we didn't expect, shocks to the system. For example, AI is very energy intensive. And as these data centers start popping up around the US, utilities are finding that they don't really have good ways of meeting this demand because they can't install an abundance of renewable energy because it doesn't make very good base load. You can't predict when it's going to be productive. And when it isn't productive, you don't really have another way to meet that demand unless you have something that can increase or decrease productivity, such as a natural gas plant. And so there are a lot of very, I want to say, lower level, to the extent that a state might have utilities or a country, small country might have utilities that are looking for ways to meet their energy demand. And they, at that level, make decisions about what they're going to use that in aggregate mean that all of the projections that we'd made, all of the promises that we'd made toward the Paris Agreement don't actually come to fruition because of some of these shocks. And the thing about the shocks is that you can't predict them. So you might have been on a trajectory to get to a certain point of renewable energy penetration in your grid, and then something happens, your city grows. You have, for example, the war in the Russian conflict that is going on right now has meant that Europe doesn't have a supply of gas from Russia anymore, has stopped taking on gas from Russia. And so you have all these new infrastructures that are being built out so that the US can send LNG to Europe. Now, once these investments have been made, people aren't going to suddenly abandon them, if this crisis, is over at any point in time. They're in there and they're going to be in there for the next 50 years, and people aren't going to want to abandon them. And so the more we build out now, the longer that we can see this extension going. And that is not something that I think we in Trinidad, for example, would have the power to tell somebody that's in Arizona that you can't build that plant. And so I think it is important that at some point in the future, we have the ability to do this because we aren't doing right now what we need to be doing to avoid the worst of this problem.
I think you have perfectly summarized the complexity of climate action and the energy transition. In an ideal world, we probably wouldn't need to focus as much on carbon capture because we would be accelerating the rate of deploying renewables and energy efficiency and even, nature-based solutions. However, the reality is based on geopolitical issues and issues of energy security and economic growth, fossil fuels continue to be a feature of modern development.
Mhm.
So, Marsha, your research focuses on environmental justice in the energy transition, particularly from the continued and expanded use of transmission pipelines to transport fuels and carbon dioxide. Can you explain to us how carbon capture intersects with environmental justice?
So, environmental justice refers to, in a very broad sense, the fair treatment and the meaningful involvement of all people in decisions about activities that have an impact on human health and the environment. So, if we're talking about a power plant, as I mentioned, or, for example, Cancer Alley, which is the area on the Gulf Coast of the US in Louisiana and Texas, where all of these petrochemical industries have developed. They've developed in areas that were already inhabited by Native Americans, by African Americans, by minority groups, and largely poor people with a limited amount of political capital and the inability to push back against these developments. And it's had a really devastating impact on the health of the people who live there, which is why it's referred to now as Cancer Alley. And so that is one of the more glaring examples and one of the more popular ones of environmental injustices that have taken place in the US. And the environmental justice movement has a lot of its roots in the civil rights movement in America. And so one of the earliest papers about this by a gentleman called Robert Bullard is speaking about how in Houston, Texas, they disproportionately put garbage dumps in neighborhoods that were primarily occupied by African Americans. And so that and a couple of other cases in the late 70s and early 80s began this entire field of study that looks at how not just energy related pollution, but all types of pollutions are located close to people who are poor, are people of color, and generally don't have the ability to resist that. And so one of the larger issues with carbon capture is, like we mentioned before, that it can give the impression, or it can give actually the license of fossil fuels to continue operating. Now, I happen to think that those are independent choices because we haven't had a carbon capture in the past necessarily, and we weren't decarbonizing then either. We did have a lot of renewable energy build out. But as far as use of fossil fuels went, we haven't really made an impact in how much we've been pumping into the atmosphere lately. There has been some reduction. There has been a lot of more renewable energy coming online, but it hasn't been nearly enough to actually solve this problem. And so unless we're committed to doing both of them, I don't know that one has a huge impact on the other. But in any event, as we burn these fossil fuels, both the processing of the fossil fuels, so if you have your refineries, and burning it at its end uses, whether it's in automobiles or at a power plant, results in toxic emissions that carbon capture doesn't actually solve. And so and in some cases, like I mentioned, because you have to burn more to operate the CCS part of your plant that is capturing the carbon, that doesn't capture all of the carbon, you're actually emitting more of these emissions. And it's still affecting the same people who live around these areas. And that's why most environmental justice organizations tend to favor immediate and rapid decarbonization and to remove carbon dioxide using more natural forms of removal. You also have the risk that the stored carbon dioxide, because they generally are being stored in or looking to be stored in formations, and they're transported through pipelines, and people are worried that they can escape from these and present a risk to people who live around them. So there was an incident in Mississippi in 2020 where a CO2 pipeline ruptured, and it sent about 50 people to the hospital, and it had about 200 people from a small town had to be evacuated. Nobody died from that, but the reports are that people who were hospitalized in that event are still having respiratory issues. And the unique risk that CO2 presents is that it's very dense. It tends to be close to the ground. So whereas if you had let's say a pipeline with natural gas in it and there was a rupture, you did have an explosion. There's a possibility of an explosion. But if you didn't have that, it would, you know, rise and disperse itself fairly effectively in most instances. Carbon dioxide will not explode, but it will sort of stay close to the ground unless there's something added to it to make it detectable. You can't really smell it. And it's also an asphyxiant. So it displaces oxygen, sorry. It can travel as a cloud, especially downhill because it's so heavy. And in the incident in Mississippi, it overcame several people. They began experiencing, headaches, and they were very confused because all the things that happen when your brain is deprived of oxygen for a while. And it cut off their vehicle. So while they were trying to evacuate, the vehicle stopped working because, of course, internal combustion vehicles require oxygen to keep the engines going. So that is a bit of the risk that people see around the carbon dioxide concentrated in particular places and of itself. And they're worried about this in both the pipelines and in places where it might be stored.
We're both from a country that sits in the energy sector. And so this is very relevant to us in terms of how the country navigates its energy future, where there's such a great emphasis on decarbonization. And you mentioned earlier, the challenge of low income and developing countries who are now being told that they have to transition to renewables, which we do support, but there is a cost. There's a
Mm-hmm.
cost to it that has to be factored in. And it's not just in economic terms, but we can see
Right.
there are social and ethical considerations that also have to be factored in.
If you look at someone like Guyana, for example, Guyana just started to develop its oil and gas resources. And so, there's a particular interview that's been on the internet of a British journalist asking a member of the Guyanese government, I don't remember if it's the prime minister or not,
The
um,
president, yes.
the president, yeah. So you know the one I'm talking about the responsibility to not develop that fossil fuel, which is a rich irony to be asked that by a European from a relatively rich country to suggest that they should then keep their people in relative poverty in order to benefit people that were able to develop their resources without compunction and they, aren't necessarily decarbonizing as quickly as they should be either. So it's a real moral quandary that I find that nations are being asked to do this by people who really got to do it for a lot longer and for a lot more money for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, we could go off on a tangent on this, which I don't want to, but the irony is that these countries that are responsible for historical emissions and continue to emit, and they are also dragging their feet on the transition itself. They continue to deploy fossil fuel based systems, they continue to emit, and they continue to ignore the plight of small island developing states who are lobbying for accelerated action, and that action has to be supported by financial flows to support
Right.
their transition, to support their adaptation, and
Mhm.
to support them in responding and recovering from loss and damage. And
Right.
so, again, the complexity of global climate change and global climate negotiations. And I don't know what to say anymore. I think because there's so much still to be done. And yet still we are facing the impacts, or we are facing the impacts of inaction, slow action.
Yeah. To be fair to them, they're ignoring a lot more than just smaller and developing states. There are a lot of promises that have been made that have not been kept because, there's like political infighting about who should control what and what should go where. And, we're contributing this amount of money, so we should be able to have this much of a say and all that kind of stuff. So, they're not just ignoring us, they're ignoring a lot of people.
So we've seen and we continue to see the disproportionate impacts on minority groups including indigenous people, people of color, and low income communities. As with traditional energy projects, carbon capture projects can inadvertently reinforce these historical environmental injustices, as they are often cited in these marginalized communities, and these communities are excluded from decision making. So while the host communities carry the burden of the project's footprint in terms of pollution, health risks, land use changes, the benefits are unequally distributed, being redirected away from these communities. And I have lived that, being
Mhm.
from a community, the community of Labrie, which is within that oil belt, they might say,
Mhm.
yet still not seeing the level of development that is commensurate with the extraction of resources from this
Right.
area. So, Masha, how can we avoid reinforcing historical environmental injustices and ensuring that carbon capture projects are aligned with community driven objectives?
So the first thing I wanted to do is to, as you correctly alluded to, that when I talk about environmental justice in the US, this replicates itself in a lot of other parts of the world, but it's not necessarily in the same groups that we see. So in some places where, the racial groups aren't as diverse, it might just be, or we don't have the same sets of groups necessarily. It could just be that poor people, rural people, people who are, from different ethnic tribes, from indigenous people who may have lived on a particular section of a country that, eventually somebody figured out that they wanted um, to extract something from there and they'd move them off away from their way of life. All of these things replicate themselves in different ways across the world. And so, looking at that from a Trinidadian perspective, that is something that we haven't really been looking at in academia, as far as I can tell. I found one paper that was published in Trinidad, but that's something we really need to get into, particularly because we've been looking at, if you read the blue hydrogen plan that we have for our energy industry, they do have CCS as a part of that. And so I haven't seen anything on direct air capture, which I wouldn't expect to because it's really in such an early stage that I wouldn't expect it to be developed in um, Trinidad as yet, or any really, low income or non-rich country. But I say that to get to the point of, we build things and the technology usually is disruptive in some way. Some are worse than others, and some aren't as bad. But the way in which we develop these projects has more of an impact on the justice of the operation or the technology or the industry because we come at it from a very one-sided point. It's always very techno-economic, and if it doesn't make sense to abate emissions, we don't do it. And so it ends up impacting the communities that we develop them um, in diverse ways, but in very drastic ways that oftentimes we say that it wasn't unintended, but we didn't go in there with the intention to mitigate those impacts. And so the first thing, particularly for carbon capture projects that we need to do, is to let go of the idea that this means that we can keep burning fossil fuels indiscriminately. Because, now we think we have a way of dealing with it. And because fossil fuels themselves have a much wider range of problems than just the carbon dioxide that's emitted. And they're usually local problems, which is why internationally everybody's worried about the carbon dioxide because the people who are worried solely about carbon dioxide are rarely impacted by the other impacts of using fossil fuels. So starting with um, destroying some of the environments where they're extracted. Some operators in some places have laws that are better than others at protecting their environments. They are more stringent in supervision, and some places are not. You have a lot of places that people are dispossessed of land. You have a very, very leaky natural gas infrastructure that, people say that natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel, but they're actually leaking so much methane into the atmosphere that Europe, in an effort to reduce the carbon footprint of its natural gas imports, which is a weird phrase, has begun to enact a program to sort of fix the leaks in the natural gas system. And so even before we get to processing and burning of these fuels, there's a lot of damage that it does just getting it out of the ground and getting into the places that we're using it. We have, if you live in Labrador, you'd have known that they have a lot of spills all the time that wash up on shore and disrupt the ecosystem. In the area, it affects a lot of fishermen. And at any one time, there are numerous spills in the oceans around the world that we don't hear about because they're not necessarily as large as, let's say, the Deepwater Horizon incident. And so none of these things actually get fixed with carbon capture, but they remain a problem, particularly the leaking of methane from the natural gas and also from the oil infrastructure. Because, like we said before, that is a very potent greenhouse gas. Eventually, it does turn into carbon dioxide after about 10 years. Um, and so, if we develop this, it can get taken out. But in the meantime, it does have a very large impact on the warming. So, the second way, and the thing that we're working on in my lab, and specifically, we work on direct air capture in the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. Well, this is one way of doing it. It's finding places where they actually would want this infrastructure to be built. So I would have mentioned before that there are a lot of places where coal is becoming less popular and they're shutting down a lot of coal plants. And so coal mines are also shutting down. And workers who were formerly in these jobs that were relatively high paying jobs are finding themselves suddenly out of work. The rural towns where these plants have been located are losing their economic base. And so I think we're a bit familiar with this in Trinidad after, the reformation of heritage. A lot of the economic activity that was secondary to the plant being there is gone. And so they would like something to replace that. And so we are um, looking at talking to communities, and this is the main point of it, talking to communities beforehand and considering their identity, who they are, what they want. Do they want more industry? Do they want something else? What is important to them? And finding a way to incorporate the things that we want to do with the things that they want to do, and looking at them as partners rather than uh, people that we have to appease or resistance that we need to overcome in order to get these plants built in a way that we've already designed them that people have had no say in. So we're going to come in and maybe buy some private land in a place that is surrounded by people who don't want this near them, who don't know what is going on, who don't understand it. I've watched a lot of community meetings and town halls in rural areas where developers go into um, places where they've already decided what they wanted to build, where they want to build it, and why, and then try to convince people that this is harmless. And then they give them, varying information depending on when you ask them. And that is, for people who have developed projects, a lot of time the information does change throughout the course of the project. But if the only time people hear from you is when you're trying to get something from them, essentially, then they're not going to trust you. And that mistrust is where, you know, there have been a lot of cancellations of different types of projects because people have pushed back against it. They've had moratoria against certain types of activities in their communities. And rightly so, because in energy, the industry hasn't necessarily had a good reputation with developing projects. And most projects are large projects are like this that people don't want near them. And so the first step is to talk to people in communities. The earlier the better if you can involve them in the process of developing the project so it matches what they want or what they require, or even identifying in the beginning communities that do not want you near them is a good step. Because if you've spent all this time and energy trying to develop a project and in the end they decide that they don't want it, you've just wasted a lot of time and a lot of resources. So trying to identify places that can see themselves not just wanting this type of technology, because it doesn't, to be fair, provide as many jobs as a power plant would. It's pretty much you set it up, it requires some amount of labor for maintenance, and it's not as labor intensive as, say, a large power plant. But can the community that you're looking at develop a different economy around it? Do they have a cement plant that can incorporate some of the captured carbon to be used in there? And will that exercise help it decrease its carbon footprint, for example? Are there credits that are available in the area where they are operating that can allow them to reduce their costs or see some sort of benefit from what they're doing? What other things can be done to not just drop a project in the middle of a community, but to integrate the community and to see them as partners in developing that process? There's a lot more to say about what can be done about this, and I don't think we have time to really exhaust all of the options that we have. But I think talking to communities is a really good first start in trying to do that.
Yes. So there you have it, folks. While carbon capture can assist with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it is not a magic solution. It is one part of several decarbonisation strategies to reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, in addition to the technical feasibility, the social and ethical factors must be addressed to ensure equitable benefits. We have to continue advocating for sustainable policies that align with environmental justice. And this applies to carbon capture projects and all other projects that form part of the sustainable energy transition. And in order to do this, we must ensure that there is fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people that can be impacted. So thank you, Marsha, for demystifying carbon capture.
Thank you so much for having me on today. It's been really great talking with you.
So how can listeners connect with you, Marsha?
So I'm on LinkedIn. That's my main page in social media. But you can reach me at linkedin.com/in/mking20. And my official email address is mking54@asu.edu.
And we'll place those links in the show notes. If you found this episode insightful, we'd love for you to share it with your network, leave us a review, or let us know your thoughts on any of our social media platforms. Don't forget to subscribe to the Climate Conscious podcast so you won't miss an episode of the Demystify series. Thank you for listening.